Tonight in Oakland by Danez Smith. I did not come here to sing a blues. Lately I open my mouth and out comes marigolds, yellow plums. I came to make the sky a garden. Give me rain or give me honey, dear Lord. The sky has given us no water this year. I ride my bike to a boy. When I get there, what we make will not be beautiful or love at all, but it will be deserved. I've started seeking men to wet the harvest. Come, tonight I declare we must move instead of pray. Tonight, east of here, 2 boys, one dressed in what could be blood, and one dressed in what could be blood before the wound, meat and mean mug. And God, tonight, let them dance. Tonight, the bullet does not exist. Tonight, the police have turned to their God for forgiveness. Tonight, we bury nothing. We serve a God with no need for shovels. We serve a God with a bad hip and a brother in prison. And tonight, let every man be his own Lord. Let wherever 2 people stand be a reunion of ancient lights. Let's waste the moon's marble glow, shouting our names to the stars until we are the stars. Oh, precious God. Oh, sweet black town. I am drunk and I thirst. When I get to the boy who lets me practice hunger with him, I will not give him the name of your newest ghost. I will give him my body, and what he does with it is none of my business. But I will say, look, I made it a whole day. Still, no rain. Still, I am without exit wound. And he will say, tonight, I want to take you how the police do, unarmed and sudden. And tonight, when we dream of dancing in a city slowly becoming ash. The themes in this poem are God and spirituality, love and physical intimacy, particularly the love and intimacy that 2 men experience together. The transformation that can occur of transforming violence through love and intimacy into a celebration, into joy. And also the Black experience in America. This is the first poem that I've read that combines these themes so skillfully, so artistically. And in this analysis video, I'll unpack with you poetic elements, connections to the world, what's known about the poet Danez Smith, a person some would say comes once in a generation, to transform our understanding of literary expression. I'm looking at the poem that's online on the Poetry Foundation. Now I want to make a note that the Poetry Foundation poem is slightly different than the poem that's in the book, Don't Call Us Dead. So Don't Call Us Dead is an anthology of poems. It is well worth buying this anthology. It's beautiful, it's amazing. I'll talk a little bit more about the anthology later in this video, but Don't Call Us Dead, the version in this book is slightly different than the poem that's on the Poetry Foundation website. Now, poets have a whole range of reasons why they might change a poem from what's in the book and on a website where the poem is published. Often, the poem that's available on a website is published before a book is published. So that might mean that the poem was either a first draft, an initial draft, maybe that poem is just a standalone poetic work, whereas the poem that's in the book might be modified slightly, and it has been modified slightly, particularly the end, to address some of the themes that come before and after. So in the book, the poem is right after a poem that's about HIV. Now, Danez Smith is HIV positive, and one of the things that Danez writes about throughout the book is Danez's experience with HIV and also police violence, being a Black person in the United States. Danez uses they, them pronouns. What you'll notice in the book and also in this poem is that as Danez is writing about their experience, Danez is using gendered pronouns. So that's a hint that maybe this poem was written before Danez fully embraced gender neutral identity. Danez's background is in spoken word poetry. And as you just look at the poem, you'll be able to see that the idea of enjambment, which is continuing the ideas from one line of the poem to the next, and adding punctuation in the middle of the line, like commas and periods, helps create a flow and a rhythm. Now, as Danez is reading the poem, the rhythm of that read delivery of the poem changes the flow of the poem. Now, I found a video online in which Danez is explaining some of the context for the poem and for Danez's work in general. And I know that Danez growing up in the Baptist church in Minnesota, that informed some of the spoken word delivery. Danez made a comment along the lines of, I'm a gay person and wherever I am, God is. There's spirituality. And so that sermon, the rhythm of a sermon in a Black church where the preacher is doing the traditional call and response kind of thing, that rhythm is what Danez has recreated in this poem, where you see the word tonight. And all of those instances where the word tonight appears are places where if this were a sermon being delivered, that would be the preacher calling. The way Danez put it, they called it calling to the singular voice, right? That singular voice of the preacher. And you can see that repeated throughout the poem. Now, I approximated the syllable stress in some places because the poem that's online is slightly different than the poem that's in the book. And I mentioned that that could be for a number of reasons. Based on that approximation of the syllable stress that is in the poem that's on Poetry Foundation, I noticed several things. The first is, as is common with spoken word, they being Danez Smith, have turned the regular pattern of stressed versus unstressed syllables on their head. And there's stress added in unexpected places. In some places, they alternate between stressed and unstressed to create a rhythmic ebb and flow, particularly in the middle of the poem. Maybe that rhythm approximates what the two boys are doing. In some places, they emphasize certain words by including two stressed syllables next to each other, whereas in regular syllable stress rules of English, those words or those syllables might not be stressed. Examples of that 13th stanza where Danez writes, "Stars, oh precious God, oh sweet black town." That's a series of stressed syllables, one right after the other, whereas in regular English stress patterns, only the nouns and also the most important nouns would be stressed.
What are your thoughts about the poem? I'd love to read your comments and respond to them, because that's the most important part.
Enjambment allows Smith to create a different feel for the poem when read on the page versus when delivered aloud. While the rhythm of the poem when read aloud is different than the rhythm that you would read on the page, the spoken poem has more of a sensual feel based on the rhythm created by Danez's voice. When I read the poem myself, I had all of these connections to the Bible and to religion come up for me, and I do believe that some of those references in the poem are part of Danez's background in the Baptist church and references to what Danez has described as their connection to spirituality. Danez has said that spirituality is a very important part of their life, and anywhere that they go, God is and spirituality is. And this is a reflection of the everyday spirituality of African American life. The spoken delivery of the poem is very musical, and much of that is attributed to the stress pattern being an approximation in some places. And here you can see the syllable stress based on the spoken delivery of this poem by Danez Smith. I went through and I listened to the poem several times to make sure that I was getting the right stress. The words that are in bold are stressed syllables. The words that are underlined are unstressed. And then the number at the end of each of the lines is the number of syllables that are on those lines. And as I mentioned before, because of enjambment, that is the continuation of ideas from one line to the next line of poetry, some of these lines, they don't just end at the end of the traditional line, they're carried over onto the next line, especially when the poem is read out loud. Punctuation, periods and commas specifically, are the big determiner of where there are breaks and where lines might flow over into the next line. This poem is organized into couplets, that is, stanzas that are 2 lines long. Most of the poem is in couplets, and then there's one tercet, that is a stanza that's 3 lines long. It's one tercet somewhere in the middle of the poem. And I started thinking, what's happening at that place where there's that tercet that really differentiates what comes before from what comes after? And what I think is happening is right there's one of the first references to the boys being intimate and God and, calling out tonight. That first tonight comes in the middle of those stanzas. So maybe this is also a reference to religion, because this poem has so many religious elements wrapped into the poem. Throughout the poem, there are references to God. Danez Smith is directly addressing God. It's called apostrophe, which is just a really fancy reference for the poem. The speaker of the poem is a person, Danez Smith, and the audience for the poem is Danez speaking directly to God. And you see that is the first place where there's that call, that direct reference to God and also to the 2 boys, which makes me think maybe that is, that's a place where instead of Danez just having a singular conversation with God and telling God something, Danez is trying to bring God into the relationship, into that union that they're having. So you have the 2 boys and God, and that's where that tercet might come from. Everything that follows, again, couplets. This is spoken word, so the rhythm is created based on speaking the poem, saying the poem out loud. There isn't a traditional rhyme structure. This is free verse. Part of the reason why I did this meter analysis, or I did the best job I could with the meter analysis, is because I wanted to see if there was some kind of rhythm that was created. Now, the meter of a poem, usually you can go to a website where you look up the meter of a poem. Since this is a newer poem, I couldn't find any analyses of this poem or any of the other poems in the book. So I did it myself. And I don't see that there's any discernible pattern for stressed versus unstressed syllables. I don't see that there's any discernible pattern for the number of syllables that are on each line. And again, because it's a free verse poem, I wouldn't necessarily expect that there would be, but sometimes poets can surprise you. And especially with Danez Smith, who seems to love sonnets, I thought that there might be something there. But the delivery of the poem really sets it apart. That delivery, the musicality of it and the rhythm creates a beautiful flow. And that beautiful flow may not follow a traditional meter, but it still is nonetheless there. So those 3 lines that I noticed, the tercet. Now, Danez Smith, being a lover of sonnets, I wonder whether or not that could be considered the fulcrum of the poem. I don't think it is. I think that if there is one in this poem, it probably comes at the very end, in the lines where the 2 boys are talking to each other and one says, "I made it to you without being wounded," and the other saying, "I want to take you like the police do, unarmed and sudden." I think that is the fulcrum of the poem, especially perhaps it's a fulcrum of the poem for the online version of the poem, since you have that extra couplet that comes at the very end that brings closure to the poem, and it adds a sense of finality having that last couplet at the end of the poem. The volta can be known as the turn or the fulcrum in a poem, and it separates one part of the poem from the next. A volta can be a simple summary of the preceding lines or a dramatic transformation of the speaker's point of view. And it often uses words like but, yet, however, to distinguish a reversal or a shift in thought. And I don't see that there, but I do see if you look back at the first tercet, you'll see that there is actually somewhat of a shift in thought going on there with bringing in the element of spirituality and the two boys together. There's that reference to blood, which, I mean, it could be a reference to so many different things, but I think the reference to blood is referring to both religious, as in throughout the Bible there are references to blood, like the blood of Christ being the thing that symbolizes forgiveness, atonement, the blood of Christ symbolizing life, right? It could be reference, especially in the poem, the book version of the poem, since the poem right before is about HIV and HIV status, that reference to blood could be about HIV status, like one boy is covered in blood before the wound, and the other one is covered in blood, or what could be blood. So it could be a reference to that HIV status. But more than likely, that blood is both a reference to violence, as in the threat of police violence, and also a religious reference to the blood of Christ, right? The blood of religion. Now, I hope that I've done this poem its justice, and that this is an analysis that helps you get deeper into understanding Danez Smith's worldview, what the poem might represent. If my analysis resonates with you, please consider liking this video, because I always feel really motivated when people like my videos, because then I'm motivated to make more. And go ahead, add a comment with your own interpretation or any connections that you make between the poem and your personal life, or your poem in the world at large, because those are always really fun to make as well. Someone who is a subscriber to my channel asked me to analyze this poem, so hopefully that subscriber also adds a comment. Thank you, and I hope you have a beautiful, lovely, wonderful day.
And this is the most important part. What are your thoughts about the poem? I'd love to read about and respond to your comments. And consider liking the video if you found value in what you watched.